Did you know that for centuries, people didn't just go to bed and wake up in the morning? Instead, they woke up deliberately at midnight for a second day in the dark. This lost hour, called the watch, was used for everything from quiet reading to conceiving children, guided only by the flicker of a candle or the embers of a fire. Today, we call it a sleep disorder, but for a medieval peasant or a lord in his castle, it was the most spiritual and productive time of their lives. Let's uncover the lost history of how we used to sleep. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable. Sleep, or more accurately, how medieval people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene influencers, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was called segmented sleep, a natural two-part sleep cycle, split neatly in half like a stale medieval biscuit. The routine was simple. You go to bed shortly after the sun went down, maybe around 8 or 9 p.m., and sleep for a solid 4 hours. This was your first sleep. Then you'd wake up. Not groggily, not because of a nightmare, but naturally. This waking period, known as the watch or dorval in French, would last for 1 to 3 hours, right around midnight. What did they do during this time? Well, pretty much anything that could be done by candlelight or the glow of a low fire. They would pray, read, if they were literate and wealthy enough to own a book and afford the candle, have a quiet chat with their bedfellows, engage in some intimacy, or simply sit and reflect on their dreams. Some would get up and do small chores, check on the livestock, or even visit neighbors. It was a time of quiet contemplation, a peaceful island in the middle of the night's dark ocean. After this interlude, they would return to bed for their second sleep, which would last until dawn. This wasn't some fringe practice. It was the norm across Europe for centuries, a deeply embedded rhythm of life that disappeared only with the advent of widespread artificial lighting in the 17th and 18th centuries. Historians have found references to it in countless documents, from legal depositions and medical texts to diaries and plays. It was so common that it didn't even need a special name for the longest time. It was just sleep. The idea of a single, uninterrupted 8-hour block of sleep is a modern invention, a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution's rigid schedules and our brightly lit nights. We've medicalized the midnight waking, calling it insomnia, but for our medieval ancestors, it was a cherished part of their nightly routine, a time for spiritual connection and quiet productivity. To truly understand why this sleep pattern was so prevalent, we have to immerse ourselves in the medieval world, a world fundamentally shaped by two forces, the setting of the sun and the ever-present authority of the Church. As Özlem Cenk explains in her work on medieval European history, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD didn't just create a political vacuum, it plunged the continent into a period of profound instability and fear. The centralized power of Rome was replaced by a patchwork of fledgling kingdoms and local lords. The Great Migrations, the so-called barbarian invasions, weren't a single event, but a continuous process that lasted for centuries, bringing waves of Goths, Vandals, Franks, and later, Vikings and Magyars across the land. For the average person, life was precarious. The primary need, as Cenk highlights, was security. This wasn't an abstract concept. It was the desperate, daily struggle to stay alive, to protect your family and your meager belongings from raiders, bandits, or the lord from the next valley over. This overwhelming need for safety dictated the very structure of society. It gave rise to feudalism, a system where the landless majority, the serfs, pledged their labor and loyalty to a local lord in exchange for protection within the walls of his manor or castle. The world shrank. For most, their entire existence would unfold within a few square miles of their birthplace. And when the sun went down, this small, familiar world became a place of immense danger. The darkness was absolute, a thick, impenetrable blanket that our modern, light-polluted minds can barely comprehend. The forests, which still covered vast swathes of Europe, were believed to be home to not just wolves and bears, but also supernatural evils, demons, sprites, and lost souls. The night was a foreign country, and you didn't travel through it lightly. And so, as we come to the absolute end of our journey through the medieval night, I hope you can see that this was not just a history lesson. It was an exploration of the human condition, of how we cope with fear, how we find meaning in the darkness, how we create community in the face of isolation, and how we prepare for the ultimate mystery of death. The medieval night was a world unto itself, a world that is almost unimaginable to us now, but one that still resonates in our deepest fears and our most profound hopes. The segmented sleep, the shared beds, the spiritual anxieties, the seasonal rhythms, all of these things were part of a coherent worldview, a way of making sense of the world and our place in it. We have lost that world, and in many ways, we are better off for it. We have conquered the darkness. We have extended our lives. We have made the night a safer and more comfortable place. But in doing so, we have also lost something, a sense of the night as a sacred time, a time of mystery and wonder, a time of connection to the natural world and to the spiritual realm. Perhaps, as we lie in our comfortable beds tonight, we can take a moment to remember that older world, to honor the struggles and the triumphs of our medieval ancestors, and to reconnect, in some small way, with the ancient rhythms of the night. Thank you for your patience, your attention, and your companionship on this long journey. Sleep well, dream deeply, and may the night bring you peace. Good night. To the autumn equinox was particularly important. It provided extra light, allowing the work to continue after the sun had set. The harvest moon was a gift, a natural extension of the working day. During the harvest, the normal rhythms of sleep would be completely disrupted. People would work until they were utterly exhausted, then collapse into a brief, deep sleep, only to rise again before dawn and start the cycle over. The harvest was a time of collective effort, a time when the entire community was united in a common purpose. And the nights of the harvest were a time of shared exhaustion, a time when the boundaries between individuals blurred and the community became a single, working organism. After the harvest was complete, there would be a celebration, a harvest festival. This was a time to give thanks for the bounty of the earth, to celebrate the hard work of the community, and to prepare for the coming winter. The harvest festival would often extend into the night, with feasting, drinking, music, and dancing. It was a release of tension, a celebration of survival, a moment of joy before the long, dark winter set in. The night of the harvest festival was a bright, noisy, joyful counterpoint to the dark, quiet nights of winter. Now, let's talk about a specific medieval sleep disorder, or rather, a condition that we would now recognize as a sleep disorder, but which was interpreted very differently in the Middle Ages: sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is a phenomenon that occurs when a person wakes up but is temporarily unable to move or speak. It is often accompanied by a feeling of pressure on the chest and vivid, often terrifying, hallucinations. Modern science understands sleep paralysis as a neurological phenomenon, a temporary disruption in the transition between sleep and wakefulness. But for the medieval mind, sleep paralysis was a demonic attack, The experience of sleep paralysis fits perfectly with the medieval belief in the incubus and the succubus. The feeling of pressure on the chest was interpreted as the physical weight of a demon sitting on the sleeper. The hallucinations were the demon itself, or the visions it was conjuring to torment the sleeper. The inability to move or speak was the demon's power, paralyzing the victim so that they could not resist or call for help. Sleep paralysis was a terrifying and deeply spiritual experience, a direct encounter with the forces of evil. The treatment for sleep paralysis, in the medieval worldview, was spiritual, not medical. The sufferer would be advised to pray more fervently, to confess their sins, to wear protective amulets, to sleep with a cross under their pillow. In severe cases, an exorcism might be performed. The goal was to drive out the demon and to protect the sleeper from future attacks. The experience of sleep paralysis reinforced the medieval belief in the reality of the supernatural, the constant presence of demons, and the vulnerability of the sleeping soul. Let's also consider the experience of sleepwalking, another phenomenon that was interpreted through a spiritual lens. Sleepwalking, or somnambulism, was seen as a sign that the soul had temporarily left the body during sleep and was wandering. This was a dangerous state. The wandering soul could be captured by demons or could become lost and unable to find its way back to the body. A sleepwalker was in a state of profound vulnerability. The treatment was to gently guide the sleepwalker back to bed and to pray for the safe return of their soul. Waking a sleepwalker abruptly was believed to be dangerous, as it could shock the soul and prevent it from re-entering the body properly. These interpretations of sleep disorders reveal the medieval worldview in its most vivid form. The body and the soul were not separate entities. They were intimately connected. Sleep was not just a physical state, it was a spiritual one. And any disruption to sleep was not just a medical problem. It was a spiritual crisis. The medieval night was a battleground, and the sleeping body was the prize. Finally, let's talk about the concept of the good death and its relationship to sleep. In the medieval Christian worldview, death was not the end. It was a transition, a passage from this life to the next. The manner of your death was incredibly important. A good death was one in which you were prepared, in which you had confessed your sins, received the last rites, and said your goodbyes to your loved ones. A bad death was a sudden, unexpected death, one in which you had no time to prepare your soul. To die in your sleep, without warning, was often seen as a bad death. It was a death that robbed you of the opportunity for final repentance and reconciliation with God. This fear of sudden death in sleep is reflected in the evening prayers, which we discussed earlier. The prayer, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," captures this anxiety perfectly. Every night, as you went to sleep, you were acknowledging the possibility that you might not wake up, that sleep might be the gateway to death. This was not a morbid obsession. It was a realistic assessment of the fragility of life in a world without modern medicine. The nightly prayer was a way of preparing for death, of ensuring that if death should come in the night, your soul would be ready. The medieval attitude towards sleep and death was fundamentally different from our own. We tend to see sleep as a temporary state, a pause in consciousness, and death as a final, irreversible end. But for the medieval mind, sleep and death were closely related. Sleep was a little death, a temporary separation of the soul from the body. And death was a final sleep, a permanent separation. This close relationship between sleep and death gave the night a profound spiritual significance. Every night was a rehearsal for the final night, every sleep a preparation for the final sleep. Before we truly say goodnight, I want to take us on one final exploration, a deep dive into a specific aspect of medieval sleep that we've only touched on: the role of seasonal variation. We live in a world of climate control, where the temperature inside our homes is largely independent of the weather outside. We can have summer and winter in summer, all at the touch of a thermostat. But for our medieval ancestors, the seasons dictated not just their work, but their sleep. The medieval year was a cycle of light and dark, of warmth and cold, and this cycle profoundly shaped the experience of the night. Let's start with winter, the long, dark season. In Northern Europe, the winter nights could be 14, 16, even 18 hours long. The sun would set in the mid-afternoon, and it wouldn't rise again until late morning. This was a vast expanse of darkness, a seemingly endless night. For the peasantry, winter was a time of relative idleness. The fields were frozen and there was little work to be done outdoors. This was the time for indoor tasks, mending tools, spinning wool, weaving cloth, carving wood. And it was a time for sleep. The long winter nights were a natural invitation to extended sleep. The first sleep might begin as early as 6 or 7 p.m., shortly after the evening meal. The dorval, that midnight waking period, would be a significant chunk of the night, perhaps 2 or 3 hours. And the second sleep would carry through until the late morning. In the depths of winter, sleep was not just a biological necessity. It was a way of conserving energy, a way of enduring the cold and the darkness. The winter night was also a time of intense cold. The medieval house, as we've discussed, was poorly insulated. The fire in the hearth would be the only source of warmth, and it would be banked at night. The temperature inside the house would plummet. People would huddle together under piles of blankets and furs, their breath misting in the cold air. The shared bed was not just a social arrangement. It was a survival strategy. The warmth of multiple bodies was essential for getting through the night without freezing. The winter night was a test of endurance, a battle against the cold and the dark. The winter night was also a time of storytelling. With the long, dark evenings and the enforced idleness, the winter was the natural season for the oral tradition. The elders would gather the family around the fire and recount the old tales, the legends of heroes, the stories of saints, the spooky folklore of the local area. These stories were not just entertainment. They were education, they were cultural transmission, they were a way of making sense of the world. The winter night was the theater for this ancient art, the darkness providing the perfect backdrop for tales of wonder and terror. Now, contrast this with the summer. In the summer, the nights were short, perhaps only 6 or 8 hours long. The sun would set late, around 9 or 10 p.m., and it would rise early, around 4 or 5 a.m. This was a time of intense activity. The fields demanded constant attention: plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting. The days were long and exhausting. The summer night was a brief respite, a short period of rest before the work began again. The two sleeps of winter might merge into a single, shorter sleep in summer. The dorval, if it existed at all, would be a brief, almost imperceptible pause. The summer night was a time of urgency, a time when every hour of daylight was precious and had to be used to the fullest. The summer night was also warmer, of course. The need for shared body heat was less acute. People might sleep with fewer blankets or even sleep outdoors on particularly hot nights. The summer night was a more comfortable, more pleasant experience than the winter night. But it was also a more dangerous time. The warm weather brought out the insects, mosquitoes, flies, fleas. It also brought out the snakes and the other creatures of the wild. And the warm nights were a time when disease could spread more easily. The summer night was a time of life and growth, but also a time of potential danger. The spring and autumn were transitional seasons, times when the length of the night was changing rapidly. The spring, with its lengthening days, was a time of hope and renewal. The world was waking up from the long sleep of winter. The autumn, with its shortening days, was a time of preparation, a time to gather the harvest and to prepare for the coming winter. The nights of spring and autumn were times of change, times when the rhythm of sleep was adjusting to the new conditions. This seasonal variation in sleep is something that we have almost completely lost. We sleep the same amount, in the same way, regardless of the season. Our artificial lights and our climate-controlled homes have decoupled our sleep from the natural rhythms of the earth. But for our medieval ancestors, sleep was intimately tied to the seasons. The length of the night, the temperature, the amount of work to be done, all of these factors shaped the experience of sleep. To understand medieval sleep, we have to understand this seasonal variation, this deep connection to the natural world. Let's also consider the role of the harvest in shaping the nocturnal life. The harvest was the most important time of the agricultural year. It was a time of intense, back-breaking labor, a race against time to bring in the crops before the weather turned. The entire community would be mobilized for the harvest. Men, women, and children would work in the fields from dawn until dusk, and sometimes even into the night. The harvest moon, the full moon closest. Now, let's consider a specific scenario. Imagine you are a young apprentice in a medieval town, say, a blacksmith's apprentice. You live in your master's house, sleeping in the workshop with the other apprentices. Your bed is a simple straw pallet on the floor, near the forge. The forge is cold now, the fire banked for the night, but the smell of hot metal and coal dust still hangs in the air. You are exhausted. You have worked a long, hard day hammering iron, stoking the fire, running errands for your master. Your muscles ache, your hands are blistered, and you are covered in soot. You lie down on your pallet, pulling a thin woolen blanket over yourself. The straw is scratchy, and you can feel the fleas beginning to bite. You can hear the snoring of the other apprentices, the distant sound of a dog barking, the creak of the building settling. You say a quick prayer, asking God to watch over you through the night. And then, you drift off into your first sleep. A few hours later, you wake. It is the Dorval. The workshop is dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the banked forge. You lie still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the night. You think about the day ahead, the work that needs to be done. You think about your family back in the village you left to come to the town. You feel a pang of homesickness. You get up, carefully, so as not to wake the others. You relieve yourself in the bucket in the corner of the workshop. You take a drink of water from the jug. You sit for a moment by the forge, warming your hands on the faint heat of the embers. You say another prayer. And then, feeling the drowsiness return, you lie back down on your pallet for your second sleep. This is your night, the night of a young apprentice in a medieval town. It is a night of hard work, of simple comforts, of quiet faith, and of the ever-present hope for a better tomorrow. Or imagine you are a lady of the manor, the wife of a knight. You live in a small castle, a fortified manor house. Your bedchamber is a private room, a luxury that most people do not have. You have a large, curtained bed, with a feather mattress and linen sheets. You have a maidservant who sleeps on a pallet at the foot of your bed. Your husband is away, fighting in a war. You are alone, responsible for managing the estate in his absence. You are worried. You worry about your husband's safety, about the harvest, about the bandits who have been raiding the neighboring villages. You say your evening prayers with your maidservant, kneeling by the bed. You ask the Virgin Mary to protect your husband and to give you the strength to carry on. You get into bed, and your maidservant draws the curtains, creating a small, private space. You lie in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the castle, the changing of the guard on the walls, the distant sound of a horse in the stables. You drift off into your first sleep. You wake in the middle of the night, the Dorval. You lie still, your mind racing with worries. You think about the letter you need to write to your husband's overlord, asking for more men to defend the estate. You think about the dispute between two of your tenants, which you need to settle. You think about your children, asleep in the nursery down the hall. You get up quietly so as not to wake your maidservant. You light a candle from the embers in the fireplace. You take out your book of hours, a beautifully illuminated prayer book that was a gift from your mother. You sit by the window, looking out at the dark landscape, and you read the prayers by the flickering candlelight. The words are a comfort, a connection to something larger than your own worries. You feel a sense of peace. After an hour or so, you feel the drowsiness return. You blow out the candle, get back into bed, and drift off into your second sleep. This is your night, the night of a lady of the manor. It is a night of responsibility, of worry, of faith, and of quiet resilience. These are just two examples, but they illustrate the incredible diversity of the medieval night. The experience of sleep was shaped by your social class, your gender, your age, your occupation, and your individual temperament. But across all these differences, there were certain shared realities. The darkness, the cold, the communal nature of life, the ever-present fear of danger, and the deep, abiding faith in God. These were the constants of the medieval night, the threads that wove together the tapestry of 1,000 years of human experience. And as we come to the end of our journey tonight, I want to leave you with a thought. We have spent so much time exploring the strangeness of the medieval night, the ways in which it was so different from our own. But perhaps the most important lesson is not how different it was, but how similar. The medieval person, like us, was trying to find safety, comfort, and meaning in a world that was often dangerous, uncomfortable, and confusing. They used the tools they had, their faith, their community, their traditions, to navigate the darkness. And in doing so, they created a rich and complex culture of the night, a culture that we have largely forgotten, but one that still has much to teach us. In our modern world, with our electric lights and our private bedrooms and our sleeping pills, we have conquered the night in a way that our ancestors could never have imagined. But in doing so, have we lost something? Have we lost the quiet contemplation of the Dorval, the shared warmth of the communal bed, the sense of the night as a sacred and mysterious time? These are questions worth pondering as you drift off to sleep tonight. Thank you for joining me on this long and winding journey through the medieval night. I hope you found it as fascinating as I have. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with wonder. Good night. Now, before we wrap up tonight's journey, let's take a moment to consider some of the more intimate and practical aspects of medieval sleep that we haven't fully explored yet. We've talked about the grand themes, the spiritual fears, the social hierarchies, the architecture of sleep, but what about the mundane, everyday details? What did it actually feel like to go to bed in the Middle Ages? What were the small rituals, the sensory experiences, the bodily realities that shaped the nightly routine? Let's start with the most basic question. What did people do to prepare for bed? In our modern world, we have elaborate bedtime routines. We brush our teeth, we wash our faces, we change into our pajamas. For the medieval person, the routine was much simpler, but no less important. As we've noted, most people slept naked, so there was no changing into night clothes. But there were other preparations. The fire in the hearth would be carefully banked for the night. This was a crucial task. The fire had to be kept alive, as it was difficult and time-consuming to relight, but it also had to be made safe, so that it wouldn't spread and burn down the house. The embers would be covered with ash, which would slow the burning and reduce the risk of stray sparks. A few larger logs might be placed on top to smolder slowly through the night, providing a small amount of warmth. The doors and shutters would be barred. This was a matter of security, a way of creating a small, defensible space against the dangers of the night. In a peasant hut, the door might be the only entrance, and barring it was the primary means of protection. In a wealthier home, there might be multiple doors and windows, and each one would be carefully secured. The act of barring the door was a symbolic as well as a practical gesture. It was a way of drawing a line between the safe, domestic space of the home and the dangerous, wild space of the night. It was a way of saying, "This is our place, and we are going to defend it." For the devout, the evening prayers were an essential part of the bedtime routine. The prayers of Compline, the final service of the canonical hours, were designed to be said before sleep. These prayers were a plea for divine protection through the night. They asked God to send his angels to watch over the sleeper, to guard them from the terrors of the night, from evil dreams, and from sudden death. The most famous of these prayers is the Nunc Dimittis, the Song of Simeon, which begins, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word." It is a prayer of surrender, a recognition that sleep is a kind of little death, a temporary relinquishing of consciousness, and a plea that if death should come in the night, the soul will be ready. For the medieval Christian, going to sleep was not a casual act. It was a spiritual one, a nightly rehearsal for the final sleep of death. And then there was the bed itself. We've talked about the structure of the bed, but what about the bedding? For the wealthy, the sheets were made of linen, a fabric that was cool in summer and could be layered for warmth in winter. Linen was a luxury, and it was a mark of status. The sheets would be changed regularly, though not as frequently as we might change them today. Laundry was a laborious process, involving hauling water, heating it, scrubbing the fabric, and then drying it. It was a major household chore, typically done once a month or even less frequently. For the peasantry, there were no sheets. The straw mattress was the sleeping surface, and it was covered with a rough woolen blanket or a sheepskin. The straw would be changed periodically, but it was always a bit scratchy, a bit musty, and always infested with fleas and lice. The itch of the flea bite was a constant, low-level annoyance, a part of the sensory landscape of the medieval night. The pillow was another luxury. For the wealthy, it might be stuffed with feathers or down, soft and supportive. For the common person, a pillow might be a rolled-up piece of clothing, a sack of straw, or simply a wooden block. The idea of a soft, comfortable pillow for everyone is a very modern one. For most of human history, people slept with their heads on something hard and unyielding. This might seem uncomfortable to us, but it was what they were used to. The body adapts to its circumstances. And what about the temperature? We've touched on this, but it's worth emphasizing. The medieval house, especially the peasant hut, was cold. There was no central heating, no insulation. The only source of warmth was the fire in the hearth, and that fire was banked at night. In the winter, the temperature inside the house would drop dramatically. You relied on the blankets, the shared body heat of your family, and, in the case of the peasantry, the body heat of the animals to stay warm. It was not uncommon for people to wake up in the morning to find that the water in the bucket had frozen solid. The cold was a constant, oppressive presence, a test of endurance. The idea of a warm, comfortable bedroom is a luxury that would have been unimaginable to most medieval people. And what about the sounds of the night? We've talked about the silence, but the silence was not absolute. It was punctuated by a variety of sounds, both inside and outside the house. Inside, there was the sound of breathing, of snoring, of the occasional cough or sigh. There was the rustle of straw, the creak of the bed frame, the settling of the house. Outside, there was the wind, the rain, the distant howl of a wolf or the bark of a dog. In the town, there was the cry of the night watch, the sound of a distant brawl, the ringing of the church bells marking the hours. These sounds were the soundtrack of the medieval night, a constant reminder that you were not alone, that the world was still out there, just beyond the thin walls of your home. And then there were the smells. We've mentioned this, but it's worth dwelling on. The medieval world was a smelly place, and the night concentrated those smells. The smell of the fire, of wood smoke and ash. The smell of unwashed bodies, of sweat and grime. The smell of the animals, of their dung and their breath. The smell of food, of onions and garlic, and whatever had been cooked for dinner. The smell of damp earth, of mildew, of decay. These smells were not just a background nuisance, they were a fundamental part of the sensory experience of the medieval night. They were the smell of life, of survival, of the close, cramped, communal existence that was the norm for most people. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the world began to change, and with it, the landscape of the night. The 14th century was a time of immense crisis and upheaval. The Great Famine of the early 14th century and, most devastatingly, the Black Death, which arrived in 1347, wiped out as much as half of Europe's population. This demographic catastrophe had a profound and paradoxical effect on the survivors. With labor suddenly in short supply, the old feudal bonds began to break down. Peasants could demand higher wages and greater freedom. The standard of living for the common person actually improved. They had more money, better food, and better housing. The one-room hut began to be replaced by larger houses with multiple rooms. The concept of privacy and the private bedroom began to filter down the social scale. At the same time, the psychological impact of the Black Death was immense. It was a cataclysm that shook the foundations of the medieval worldview. God's orders seemed to have been overturned. Death was everywhere, and it was random and terrifying. This led to a new, more intense, and more morbid piety. The memento mori tradition, the reminder that you must die, became pervasive in art and literature. The night, already a time of spiritual anxiety, became even more freighted with the fear of sudden, unprepared death. The Dorval might have become a more fervent time of prayer, a desperate plea for deliverance from the pestilence that walked in darkness. The growth of cities in the late Middle Ages also changed the night. The medieval city was a noisy, crowded, and vibrant place. And it didn't entirely shut down at night. The taverns and brothels did a roaring trade. The streets, though officially under curfew, were home to a thriving nocturnal subculture. The urban night was a place of opportunity, of anonymity, of sin. The old, rural rhythm of sleep, tied to the rising and setting of the sun, began to be replaced by a more artificial, urban rhythm tied to the demands of commerce and the temptations of pleasure. This was the world in which the first glimmers of our modern, 24-hour society can be seen. The rise of literacy, spurred by the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, was another crucial change. As books became cheaper and more widely available, more people could read. And as we've seen, reading was a perfect activity for the quiet of the Dorval. The silent, solitary reader, lost in a book, is a figure that we associate with the modern world, but their origins can be traced back to these late medieval nights. The book provided a new kind of private, mental space, a retreat from the communal world. So, as we stand at the threshold of the early modern period, we can see that the ancient, monolithic world of medieval sleep is beginning to fracture. The foundations are being laid for a new kind of night, a night that is more private, more literate, more urban, and, with the advent of better artificial lighting, simply shorter. The 1,000-year reign of segmented sleep is coming to an end. But the memory of that older world, a world of deep darkness and shared beds, of spiritual fears and watchful midnights, is not entirely gone. It's encoded in our folklore, in our language, in the very architecture of our fears. It's a lost continent in our collective history, a reminder of a time when the night was not just a void to be passed through, but a place to be lived in, and that feels like a good place to leave it for tonight. We've journeyed from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, all through the lens of that most simple and mysterious of human activities, sleep. We've seen how the medieval world was shaped by the rhythms of light and dark, how the night was a landscape of fear, faith, and community, and how our ancestors inhabited the darkness in ways that are almost unimaginable to us now. We've explored the shared beds of the peasantry, the fortified chambers of the nobility, and the disciplined dormitories of the monks. We've listened for the whispers of demons in the dark and for the reassurances of the morning bells. I hope it's given you a new appreciation for the complexity and the strangeness of the past, and perhaps a new perspective on your own relationship with the night. In our next journey, we'll delve even deeper. We'll explore the wild world of medieval dreams in more detail. We'll look at the specific crimes of the night, and we'll examine how the changing world of the Renaissance and the Reformation created a whole new kind of night. But for now, the second sleep is calling. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please do leave a like and maybe a comment to let me know your thoughts. It's always a pleasure to read them. Until next time, sleep well and don't let the bedbugs bite. The fears of childhood were not dismissed as fantasy. In a world where the supernatural was real, a child's fear of a monster under the bed was treated with a certain gravity. The monster might not be real, but the demon it represented was. The child would be taught the proper prayers, how to make the sign of the cross, how to call on their guardian angel for protection. The fears of the night were not to be banished with a rational explanation, but to be countered with the weapons of faith. The night was a training ground for the spiritual battles that every Christian was expected to fight throughout their life. Now, let's consider the other end of the life cycle, the elderly. How did the old experience the medieval night? In a society where life expectancy was low, to reach old age was a significant achievement. The elderly were respected for their wisdom and their experience. They were the living repositories of the community's history and folklore, and the Dorval was their natural stage. While younger adults might use the midnight watch for chores or intimacy, the elderly, often past the age of hard labor and child-rearing, could dedicate this time to reflection and storytelling. An old man, his body aching from a lifetime of toil, might find it difficult to sleep for long stretches. The segmented sleep pattern would have suited his physiology perfectly. In the quiet of the Dorval, he could sit by the fire, his mind clear, and share his memories with the younger generations. He could recount the stories of the great famine of his youth, the time the Lord's father went on crusade, the legend of the local saint. This was a vital process of oral history, the weaving of the community's identity, and it happened in the quiet heart of the night. For an old woman, the Dorval could be a time of spiritual authority. As a crone, a postmenopausal woman, she was often seen as having a special connection to the spiritual world. She was the keeper of herbal lore, the one who knew the ancient remedies for sickness, the one who could assist the midwife at a difficult birth. In the quiet of the night, she might pray, meditate, or prepare her remedies. Her sleeplessness was not a medical problem, but a sign of her spiritual wakefulness. She was the wise woman, the watcher of the night, a figure of both respect and fear. Sickness, too, had a special relationship with the night. It was a common observation, then as now, that fevers tend to spike at night. The sick person, already weakened, would face their greatest trial in the darkness. The night was a time of crisis. The family would gather around the sickbed, keeping a vigil. They would pray, they would administer what remedies they had, they would wipe the fevered brow. This was the death watch. In a world without modern medicine, many illnesses were a death sentence, and the night was when the final battle between life and death was often fought. To sit with a dying person through the night was a profound act of love and a solemn Christian duty. You were there to offer comfort, to pray for their soul, and, if they were conscious, to help them make their final peace with God. The moment of death itself, if it came in the night, was a moment of supreme spiritual significance. The soul had departed its earthly vessel and begun its journey into the afterlife. The watchers would close the eyes of the deceased, say the prayers for the dead, and begin the preparations for the funeral. The night was the antechamber of death, a space of sorrow, fear, and intense spirituality. Let's try to imagine the sensory experience of the medieval night. We are so saturated with visual information that we can barely comprehend a world of true darkness. For our medieval ancestors, when the sun went down and the fire was banked, the world was primarily experienced through the other senses, hearing and smell. The silence would have been profound, a deep, resonant quiet that we rarely experience. And into this silence, every small sound would have been magnified and imbued with meaning. The creak of a floorboard, the sigh of the wind, the distant howl of a wolf, these were the sounds that populated the night. A person's hearing would have been incredibly acute. They would have been able to distinguish the sound of a familiar footstep from that of a stranger, the sound of their own livestock from that of a predator. The world of the night was a soundscape, and to navigate it, you had to be a skilled listener. Smell, too, would have been a primary sense. The one-room peasant hut would have been a rich tapestry of smells. The wood smoke from the fire, the smell of unwashed bodies, the pungent aroma of the animals, the smell of cooking, of damp earth, of straw. These smells were not just a background nuisance, they were information. The smell of smoke could be a comforting sign of home, or it could be a warning of a dangerous fire. The smell of sickness, the sweet, cloying scent of infection, was a harbinger of death. In the town, the night air would be thick with the smell of refuse thrown into the streets, the stench from the butcher's shop or the tannery. The night had its own distinct and often unpleasant olfactory signature, and then came the dawn. It's hard for us to appreciate the sheer, unadulterated relief that the first glimmer of dawn would have brought to the medieval mind. The dawn was a daily miracle, a victory of light over darkness, of life over death, of order over chaos. It was a powerful symbol of Christ's resurrection, the ultimate triumph over the darkness of the grave. The rising of the sun was not just a physical event, it was a spiritual one. The morning prayers, lauds, were a joyful celebration of this daily victory. The bells would ring, calling the community to prayer, their sound chasing away the last of the night's demons. The world was reborn. The fears of the night dissolved in the clear, clean light of a new day. The farmer could go to his fields, the craftsman to his workshop, the merchant to his market. The world was safe again. This daily rhythm, from the anxiety of dusk to the relief of dawn, was the fundamental pulse of medieval life. It's also important to remember that the Middle Ages spanned 1,000 years and a vast geographical area. The experience of sleep and the night was not monolithic. It varied enormously depending on where you lived. Consider the difference between Italy and Scandinavia. In Italy, the nights are relatively short, even in winter. The climate is mild. The legacy of Roman urbanism was stronger, and towns and cities remained more important than in the north. The Italian night was perhaps a little less terrifying, a little more social than the night of the deep, dark forests of Germany or the long, frigid nights of a Scandinavian winter. In Scandinavia, during the winter, the sun might only appear for a few hours a day. The night was a vast, oppressive, 18-hour reality. It's no surprise that the folklore of these regions is so rich in tales of trolls, giants, and other creatures of the long dark. The segmented sleep pattern, with its long dorval, would have been an essential coping mechanism for getting through the sheer, mind-numbing tedium of the endless winter night. It was a time for epic storytelling, for the reciting of the great sagas, for the intricate work of carving and weaving that could be done by the light of the fire. For the medieval traveler, a night at an inn was a necessary evil, a brief and often uncomfortable pause in their journey. Finally, let's consider the experience of sleep for the medieval soldier on campaign. If the castle was a fortress designed for defense, an army in the field was a mobile fortress, and its nightly encampment was a temporary castle. The first priority when an army stopped for the night was to create a defensible position. A camp would be established, often fortified with a ditch and a palisade. Sentries would be posted, and regular patrols would be sent out to guard against a surprise attack. Sleep for the common soldier was a precious and fleeting thing. They would sleep on the hard ground, in all weathers, huddled together for warmth. They would sleep in their armor, their weapons by their side, ready to leap into action at a moment's notice. Their sleep would be broken by their turn on watch duty, a period of intense, nerve-wracking alertness, staring into the darkness and listening for any sound of the enemy. The psychological toll of this kind of fragmented, high-stress sleep must have been immense. It's no wonder that medieval chronicles are full of stories of armies being routed by surprise night attacks. A sleeping army was a vulnerable army, and a good commander knew that the battle for the next day could be won or lost in the dispositions he made for the night, from the king in his canopied bed to the soldier on the cold ground, from the monk in his disciplined dormitory to the traveler sharing a flea-ridden mattress with a stranger. The experience of sleep in the Middle Ages was incredibly diverse. But it was always shaped by the shared realities of a world without artificial light, a world of communal living, a world of deep spiritual belief and ever-present fear. The night was not an empty space, but a landscape of its own, with its own rules, its own dangers, and its own strange beauty. It was a world we have almost completely forgotten, but one that still haunts the edges of our modern, well-lit lives. Every time we are startled by a noise in the night, every time we are unsettled by a strange dream, we are feeling the faint echo of that older, darker, more mysterious world. Approximate 9,000 words. Let's pivot to a group whose experience of the medieval night was uniquely shaped by their social role and biology: women. For a medieval woman, the night was a space of both particular vulnerabilities and unique responsibilities. Her experience of sleep, the dorval, and the darkness was filtered through the lens of her gender in a society that was overwhelmingly patriarchal, and the theological framework of the Church. Woman was the inheritor of Eve's sin. She was seen as being morally weaker than man, more susceptible to temptation, and a potential source of sin for men. This view had a direct impact on how women's sleep was perceived. A sleeping woman was seen as being particularly vulnerable to demonic influence. The incubus, the male demon who is said to prey on sleeping women, was a very real fear. A woman who woke up feeling strangely aroused or who had erotic dreams might fear that she had been visited by such a demon. This was not just a personal spiritual crisis, it could have devastating social consequences. In a culture obsessed with female chastity, any hint of sexual impropriety, even in a dream, could be ruinous to a woman's reputation. Beyond the demonic, the physical dangers of the night were more acute for women. In the communal sleeping arrangements of the peasant hut or the inn, a woman was at risk of sexual assault. The darkness and the lack of privacy that were a feature of medieval life made it difficult to police male behavior. While the law might punish such crimes, the burden of proof was high, and the shame would invariably fall on the woman. For many women, the night was a time for vigilance, for sleeping lightly, for being aware of the movements of the men around them, but the night was also a time of uniquely female labor. The dorval, that midnight waking period, was not always a time of quiet contemplation for a woman. It was often an extension of her domestic duties. A mother would use the time to nurse her infant. In a world without formula or feeding bottles, breastfeeding was the only way to nourish a baby, and night feedings were a non-negotiable part of a mother's life. She would wake, take the baby to her breast, and sit in the quiet dark, the rhythmic sucking of the infant the only sound. This was a bond, a duty, and a form of labor that was exclusively female. Childbirth itself was a drama that often unfolded in the dead of night. The bed, as we've seen, was the site of birth. When a woman went into labor, her bedchamber would be transformed into a bustling, exclusively female space. The midwife, a figure of immense importance in the medieval community, would be summoned. The woman's female relatives and neighbors would gather to offer support, to pray, and to assist. The men would be banished. The bedchamber would become a sacred, female-only zone, filled with the sounds of prayer, encouragement, and, of course, the woman's cries of pain. To be born in the dead of night was common, and for the women attending the birth, it meant a long, sleepless vigil, a shared experience of fear, hope, and intense physical and emotional labor. And what of the children themselves? How did they experience the medieval night? For a child, the world was already a place of wonder and terror, and the night amplified both of these things. The communal bed was the child's first environment. A child would sleep pressed close to their mother, their siblings, their father. This had the obvious benefit of warmth and a feeling of security. To be surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of your family was a comfort against the vast, frightening darkness. Bed sharing was the universal norm. The modern Western practice of putting a baby in a separate room, in a crib, would have been seen as dangerously negligent, a form of abandonment, but this practice also had its dangers. The risk of a parent rolling over and suffocating an infant was very real, and it was a recognized tragedy in the Middle Ages. The Church even issued warnings about it, urging parents to be careful. For a child, the shared bed was a place of both comfort and potential danger, a microcosm of the wider world. Lullabies were a key part of the bedtime ritual. A mother would sing to her child to soothe them to sleep. These lullabies were not always the gentle, saccharine songs we think of today. Many medieval lullabies have a dark, melancholic edge to them. They speak of the hardships of life, the sorrows of the world, the ever-present reality of death. The famous rockabye Baby Lullaby, with its rather alarming final lines about the cradle falling, captures this sense of fragility. While its exact origins are debated and may be post-medieval, the sentiment it expresses is timeless. A lullaby was a way of acknowledging the dangers of the world while simultaneously trying to create a small, safe space of song for the child to fall asleep in. It was a prayer, a charm, and a history lesson all rolled into one. And what about the monastery? The monastery was a highly structured, purpose-built environment, and its architecture reflected its function. The Rule of Saint Benedict, which governed most Western monasteries, had specific instructions for the sleeping arrangements. The monks were to sleep in a common dormitory. If possible, they should all sleep in one room, but if their numbers were too great, they could be divided into groups of 10 or 20 with a senior monk to supervise them. A candle was to be kept burning in the dormitory all night. The monks were to sleep clothed and girded so that they would be ready to rise for prayer without delay. The beds were to be simple: a mattress, a blanket, and a pillow. The goal was to avoid comfort and luxury, which were seen as temptations of the flesh. The monastic dormitory was a machine for disciplined, communal sleep, a physical manifestation of the monks' collective devotion and their rejection of worldly comforts. We have three distinct architectures of sleep. The castle, a fortress where sleep is a matter of security and hierarchy. The hut, a cramped, smoky space where sleep is a brief respite from labor, shared with family and animals, and the monastery, a disciplined, functional space where sleep is a regulated part of a larger, spiritual machine. In each case, the physical environment profoundly shaped the experience of the night. It determined who you slept with, what you heard and smelled, and how safe you felt. The medieval sleeper was never truly alone. They were always embedded in a social and architectural context that defined their nightly experience. This communal aspect of medieval life extended to the law. How did the legal system deal with the night? Most medieval towns had a curfew. At a certain hour, usually signaled by the ringing of a bell, the town gates would be locked and all law-abiding citizens were expected to be in their homes. Anyone found on the streets after the curfew was subject to suspicion and arrest. The curfew was a practical measure to prevent crime and fires. It was much easier to police a town when everyone was indoors. The night watch would patrol the empty streets, questioning anyone they encountered and dealing with any disturbances. Crimes committed at night were often seen as being more serious than those committed during the day. The darkness provided a cloak for the criminal, which was seen as an aggravating factor. Burglary, a crime that typically happens at night, was punished severely, often by hanging. The law recognized the particular vulnerability of the sleeping household and sought to protect it with the harshest penalties. The legal records of the period are full of cases of nighttime violence, of disputes between neighbors that escalated in the dark, of thieves caught in the act. The night was a time when the normal social controls were weakened, and the law stepped in to try to maintain order through fear of punishment. What about those who had to travel? In a world without paved roads or streetlights, traveling at night was a fool's errand. It was slow, difficult, and incredibly dangerous. You could lose your way, your horse could stumble and break a leg, or you could fall into a ditch. And then there were the human predators, the bandits and highwaymen who preyed on travelers. For this reason, people planned their journeys to ensure that they could reach a safe lodging before nightfall. This safe lodging was usually a monastery or a commercial inn. Monasteries had a religious duty to offer hospitality to travelers. They would have a guest house where travelers could get a simple meal and a bed for the night. The quality of the accommodation would vary depending on the traveler's social status. A nobleman might be given a private room, while a poor pilgrim would sleep on the floor of a common hall. But it was safe. You were within the protected walls of the monastery, and you were expected to abide by its rules, rising and praying with the monks. Commercial inns were a more secular option, found in towns and along major trade routes. The medieval inn was a rough-and-ready place. You would be lucky to get a private room. Most travelers slept in a common room, often sharing a bed with one or more complete strangers. The beds were notoriously infested with fleas, lice, and bedbugs. The food was basic, and the drink was plentiful. Brawls were common. You had to sleep with one eye open, your money pouch tied securely to your body. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales gives a vivid picture of the motley crew of characters you might encounter at a medieval inn. It was a microcosm of the wider world, a place of social mixing, storytelling, and potential danger. So, what did a medieval physician prescribe for a sleep disorder? The treatments were all aimed at restoring the body's humoral balance. If you were suffering from insomnia, your doctor would try to cool and moisten your body. He might recommend a change in diet, advising you to eat cool and moist foods like lettuce, cucumbers, and fish. He might prescribe a bath in cool water. And he would almost certainly recommend herbal remedies. The most common sleep aids, or soporifics, were plants that were believed to have cooling and moistening properties. These included lettuce, poppy, mandrake, and henbane. These herbs would be made into potions, syrups, or ointments. A common remedy was to soak a sponge in a mixture of these herbs and have the patient inhale the fumes. It's a testament to the potency of these plants that some of these remedies actually worked, although they were also highly toxic and could be fatal in the wrong dosage. Mandrake and henbane, in particular, are powerful hallucinogens and narcotics. The line between a good night's sleep and a permanent one could be perilously thin. For those suffering from excessive sleepiness, the treatment was the opposite. The physician would try to heat and dry the body to counteract the excessive phlegm. The patient would be advised to eat hot and dry foods like peppers, onions, and roasted meat. They would be encouraged to exercise, to get their blood moving, and to build up a sweat. The herbal remedies would be stimulants, things that would quicken the pulse and sharpen the senses, like mustard or nettles. The goal was to shake the patient out of their sluggish state and restore them to a state of wakeful vitality. This humoral theory also provided a physical explanation for dreams. Dreams, according to Galen, were the result of the vapors rising from the humors in the stomach during sleep. The nature of your dreams was determined by your dominant humor. A sanguine person would have pleasant, cheerful dreams. A choleric person would have angry, violent dreams. A phlegmatic person would have watery, indistinct dreams. And a melancholic person, suffering from an excess of black bile, would have dark, terrifying nightmares. This is where the medical and the theological explanations for dreams intersected. A nightmare could be a demonic attack, but it could also be a symptom of melancholy. The priest might try to exorcise the demon, while the physician would try to purge the black bile. Often they would work in tandem. The patient might be given a purgative to cleanse the body and be instructed to pray and go on a pilgrimage to cleanse the soul. Health was a matter of both physical and spiritual balance. This deep connection between the body, the soul, and the cosmos is one of the defining features of the medieval worldview.
Nothing happened by chance.
Everything, from a sleepless night to a prophetic dream, was part of a complex web of meaning, a constant dialogue between the microcosm of the human body and the macrocosm of God's creation. To understand medieval sleep, we have to understand this enchanted worldview, a world in which a simple bedtime story could be a lesson in theology and a nightmare could be a medical diagnosis. Let's zoom in on the architecture of sleep. We've talked about the difference between the lord's castle and the peasant's hut, but it's worth examining the layout of these spaces in more detail to understand how they shaped the experience of sleep. The classic medieval castle of the High Middle Ages was not a comfortable home.
It was a military machine.
Its thick stone walls, its narrow slit windows, its moats and battlements, every feature was designed for defense. Comfort was a distant secondary consideration. In an early castle, the social life was centered on the Great Hall. This was a large, open, multi-purpose space. The lord and his family would eat here, conduct business here, and entertain guests here. And at night, the floor of the Great Hall would be covered with straw, and it would become a dormitory for the bulk of the household. The soldiers, the servants, the squires. They would sleep communally, huddled together for warmth and security. The fire in the central hearth would be kept burning all night, as much for light and security as for warmth. The lord and his lady might have a small, private room off the Great Hall, the solar, but even this was not entirely private. As we've noted, a servant or a guard would likely sleep in the same room. This lack of privacy had a profound effect on sleep. There was no quiet retreat from the world. You slept surrounded by the sounds and smells of other people, snoring, coughing, muttering, the stench of unwashed bodies. This communal sleeping arrangement was a powerful enforcement of social hierarchy. The lord, in his curtained bed, was physically separated from and elevated above his retainers on the floor. But it also created a sense of shared vulnerability and interdependence. They were all in it together, a small island of humanity barricaded against the dangers of the night. As the Middle Ages progressed, castles and manor houses became more complex and more comfortable. The solar evolved into a more elaborate suite of private rooms for the lord and his family: the bedchamber, the withdrawing room, the chapel. The bedroom as we know it, a room dedicated solely to sleeping, began to emerge, at least for the very wealthy. But even in the late Middle Ages, the bedchamber was not a completely private space. It was still a place where the lord or lady might receive important guests, and personal servants would still sleep in the same room or in an adjoining antechamber. The idea of the bedroom as a sacrosanct, private space is a very modern one now. Contrast this with the peasant's hut. This was typically a one-room dwelling, built of wattle and daub, a framework of woven branches covered in clay and straw, with a thatched roof. There were no windows, just a hole in the roof to let out the smoke from the central fire. The floor was packed earth. This single room was where the family cooked, ate, and slept. And as we've seen, in the winter, they would often share this space with their most valuable animals. The conditions were cramped, smoky, and unsanitary. The risk of fire was immense. A stray spark from the hearth could set the thatched roof ablaze in an instant, trapping the entire family inside. This was a constant, low-level fear that must have colored the experience of going to sleep. Let's turn our attention back to the great organizer of medieval life and, by extension, medieval sleep: the church. It's impossible to overstate the influence of the church on the medieval psyche. It wasn't just a building you went to on Sundays. It was an all-encompassing spiritual, political, and social reality. The church dictated the calendar, the law, the moral code, and the very meaning of life and death. And, as you might expect, it had a great deal to say about the mysterious, vulnerable state of sleep. The church's view of sleep was, like many of its doctrines, complex and somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, sleep was a divine gift, a necessary respite for the weary body, a small taste of the peace of paradise. The Bible is full of references to God granting sleep to his beloved. In this view, peaceful sleep was a sign of a clear conscience and a soul at peace with its Creator. A troubled, sleepless night, on the other hand, could be a sign of spiritual turmoil, of guilt, or of demonic influence. The inability to sleep was a form of divine punishment, a torment for the wicked. On the other hand, sleep was a state of profound vulnerability, not just physically, but spiritually. When you were asleep, your rational mind, your conscious will, was dormant. Your guard was down. This was when the devil and his minions could do their best work. The sleeping soul was like an unguarded city, susceptible to attack. This is why the prayers of Compline, the final service of the day, were so important. They were a spiritual battening down of the hatches, an appeal for divine protection through the long, dangerous night. The prayers often included pleas for God to send his angels to watch over the sleeper, to guard them from the terrors of the night, from evil dreams, and from the temptations of the devil. The concept of sloth, or aestia in Latin, was one of the 7 deadly sins, and it was intimately connected with sleep. Aestia wasn't just laziness, it was a kind of spiritual listlessness, a weariness of the soul that led to a neglect of one's spiritual duties. And what was the primary symptom of aestia? An excessive love of sleep. To lie in bed after the sun had risen, to prefer the comfort of the palate to the duties of the day, was not just a personal failing, it was a sin. It was a rejection of God's gift of a new day, a turning away from the work that he had given you to do. The monk who fell asleep during the midnight service, the peasant who failed to rise at dawn to tend his fields, both were guilty of aestia. This created a constant tension. Sleep was necessary and God-given, but too much sleep, or sleep at the wrong time, was a path to damnation, This spiritual anxiety surrounding sleep is vividly illustrated in the medieval understanding of dreams, which we touched on earlier. The Church taught that dreams could come from one of three sources: from God, divine revelations; from the devil, demonic temptations; or from the body itself, the result of an imbalance of the humors, which we'll get to in a moment. The great challenge for the medieval dreamer was to discern the origin of their dreams. A dream that inspired piety, charity, and good works was likely from God. A dream that was filled with violence, lust, or pride was almost certainly from the devil. And a dream that was simply bizarre and nonsensical was probably just the result of eating too much cheese before bed. The lives of the saints are filled with stories of divine dreams. An angel appears to a saint in a dream to reveal the location of a holy relic. Christ himself appears to a mystic to show her the torments of the damned. These dreams were not just personal experiences, they were public events shared with the community and recorded for posterity. They were proof of the saint's holiness and a source of divine guidance for the faithful, but for every divine dream, there were 1,000 demonic ones. The devil, it was believed, could use dreams to lead even the most devout soul into sin. He could conjure up images of wealth and power to tempt a monk to abandon his vows. He could create erotic dreams to torment a celibate priest. He could fill a person's mind with heretical ideas, disguised as divine revelations. The dream world was a spiritual battlefield, and you had to be constantly on your guard. This is why confession was so important. If you had a disturbing or sinful dream, you were expected to confess it to your priest. The priest, as God's representative, could help you to understand the dream's meaning, to resist the devil's temptations, and to receive absolution. The act of confessing the dream robbed it of its secret power and brought it out into the light of the Church's authority. This brings us to the medieval medical understanding of sleep, which was inextricably linked with the theological one. Medieval medicine was based on the classical Greek theory of the four humors, which had been passed down through the works of Hippocrates and Galen. This theory held that the human body was composed of four basic substances, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with an element: air, water, fire, earth, and a set of qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. A person's health and temperament were determined by the balance of these four humors. A person with an excess of blood was sanguine, cheerful, optimistic. An excess of phlegm made one phlegmatic, calm, unemotional. An excess of yellow bile made one choleric, angry, irritable. And an excess of black bile made one melancholic, sad, depressed. Sleep, in this system, was understood as a process of the body cooling and moistening, allowing the vital spirits to retreat from the surface of the body to the interior, where they could be recharged. A good night's sleep was essential for maintaining the proper balance of the humors. Insomnia, on the other hand, was seen as a sign of a humoral imbalance. It was often attributed to an excess of yellow bile, choler, which was hot and dry and therefore antithetical to the cool, moist nature of sleep. A choleric person, with their fiery temperament, was thought to be prone to lying awake at night, their mind racing with angry thoughts. Conversely, an excess of phlegm, which was cold and moist, could lead to excessive sleepiness, the sin of sloth made manifest in the body. The phlegmatic person was seen as being sluggish, lazy, and constantly drowsy. The ideal was a perfect balance, a state of eucrasia, which would result in a healthy, moderate sleep pattern. And what did people wear in bed? The surprising answer, for the most part, is nothing. For most of the Middle Ages, the common practice across all social classes was to sleep naked. This might seem counterintuitive in a cold, drafty world, but it had a practical logic. Clothing was valuable, and sleeping in it would cause it to wear out faster. More importantly, Sleeping naked was a way to avoid lice and other vermin, which would infest clothing. You would get into bed, take off your day clothes, and huddle under the covers for warmth. The idea of specific nightwear, like nightgowns or pajamas, was a much later development, becoming common only in the early modern period. For our medieval ancestors, the bed itself, with its layers of blankets and shared body heat, was the primary source of warmth. This entire ecosystem of sleep, the segmented pattern, the fears, the dreams, the communal beds, began to unravel in the early modern period. The single biggest factor in this change was the proliferation of artificial light. In the 17th and 18th centuries, new technologies made candles and oil lamps cheaper and more efficient. The rise of a prosperous urban middle class meant that more people could afford to light their homes after dark. The night began to retreat. People started staying up later, socializing, reading, and working. The first sleep was pushed back from 8 or 9 p.m. to 10 or 11 p.m. As the bedtime moved later, the midnight waking period, the dorval, began to shrink. It was no longer a 2-hour island of quiet contemplation, but a brief, annoying interruption. The two sleeps began to merge into one. Then came the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and 19th centuries. This was the final nail in the coffin of segmented sleep. The factory imposed a new, rigid, and unforgiving temporality on human life. The factory whistle, not the sun, now dictated when you woke up and when you went to sleep. You had to be at the factory at a specific time, and you worked for a set number of hours. This new industrial capitalism demanded a workforce that was efficient, disciplined, and predictable. The leisurely, two-part sleep of the pre-industrial world was a luxury that the factory worker could not afford. Sleep had to be consolidated into a single, efficient block, a period of recharging so that the worker could return to the factory the next day and be productive. The idea of the 8-hour workday gave rise to the idea of the 8-hour sleep. By the end of the 19th century, the old pattern of segmented sleep had all but vanished from the collective memory of the Western world. It survived only in a few rural, isolated communities. The midnight waking period, once a normal and valued part of the night, was now pathologized. It was given a new name: insomnia. It was no longer a time for prayer and reflection, but a medical problem, a failure of the body to achieve the new ideal of a single, uninterrupted block of sleep. Doctors began to prescribe remedies for it: opiates, alcohol, and later, modern sleeping pills. We had forgotten how to sleep like our ancestors. We had traded the quiet, contemplative darkness of the dorval for the anxious, lonely darkness of modern insomnia. And so, as we lie in our comfortable, private beds, in our climate-controlled, brightly lit homes, it's worth remembering this lost world of medieval sleep. It's a world that challenges our most basic assumptions about how we should rest. It reminds us that our experience of sleep is not a biological universal, but a cultural and historical artifact. The medieval night, with its deep darkness, its shared beds, its ever-present fears, and its quiet, watchful interlude, is a stark contrast to our own. It was a world where sleep was more communal, more spiritual, and perhaps, in its own strange way, more connected to the natural rhythms of the earth and the soul. It makes you wonder, in our quest for the perfect, uninterrupted 8 hours, what have we lost? What quiet conversations, what deep thoughts, what spiritual connections have we sacrificed at the altar of modern efficiency? The next time you find yourself awake at 2 a.m., instead of reaching for your phone or worrying about the day ahead, perhaps you can take a moment to just be. To listen to the quiet of the house, to reflect on your dreams, to connect with that ancient, forgotten rhythm of the dorval. You might just find that the night has more to offer than you ever imagined. Perhaps the most terrifying of all the supernatural night terrors was the wild hunt. This was a widespread belief across much of Europe, a spectral procession of ghostly hunters and hounds that would tear across the night sky, particularly on stormy winter nights. To witness the wild hunt was a terrible omen, a harbinger of war, plague, or your own death. To be caught in its path was to be swept away, your soul lost forever. This was a powerful folk myth, a personification of the wild, untamable, and terrifying power of the stormy night. It served as a stark reminder to stay inside, to bar the door, and to pray for the coming of the dawn. Given this constant backdrop of fear, both rational and supernatural, it's no wonder that sleep itself was a fraught experience. And when people did sleep, their dreams were taken incredibly seriously. In the medieval worldview, dreams were a channel of communication with the spiritual realm. They could be messages from God, from the saints, or from the devil. The second sleep, that lighter, pre-dawn sleep, was considered to be the time of the most significant and prophetic dreams. The body was rested, the mind was clear, and the soul was more receptive to these supernatural communications. People would actively try to interpret their dreams. There were even dream books in circulation which provided a kind of dictionary of dream symbols. To dream of a snake might mean you have a hidden enemy. To dream of flying might mean you will achieve great success. But the interpretation of dreams was also a highly personal and spiritual matter. You might discuss your dreams with your spouse, your friends, or, most importantly, your priest. A priest could help you to discern whether a dream was a divine revelation or a demonic temptation. A particularly vivid or disturbing dream could be the catalyst for a pilgrimage, a vow, or a change in one's life. Dreams were not just the meaningless flotsam of the sleeping mind. They were a vital source of information and guidance. This brings us back to the bed itself, the physical stage on which these nightly dramas of sleep, fear, and dreams unfolded. The bed was one of the most important pieces of furniture in the medieval household, and its form and function reveal a great deal about the society. As we've noted, for the peasantry, the bed was a simple affair, a straw pallet on the floor. But for the wealthy, the bed was a complex and significant object. The great canopied bed of a nobleman was a status symbol, a display of wealth and power. The frame would be made of heavy, carved oak. The curtains, often made of rich, heavy fabrics like velvet or brocade, were not just for show. They created a small, private, and warm room within the larger, drafty bedchamber. In a world where privacy was a rare commodity, the curtained bed was a sanctuary. The mattress, or bed tick, would be stuffed with the softest materials available, feathers, especially goose feathers, down, or horsehair. This was a far cry from the scratchy, flea-infested straw of the peasant's pallet. The sheets would be made of fine linen, another luxury item, and the bed would be piled high with woolen blankets and fur throws for warmth. The sheer amount of fabric and craftsmanship that went into a noble's bed made it one of the most valuable items in the household. It was so valuable, in fact, that it was often specifically mentioned in wills. To inherit the master's bed was to inherit a significant part of his status and wealth. Shakespeare famously left his second-best bed to his wife, a bequest that has puzzled and intrigued scholars for centuries. Was it a slight, or was the second-best bed the one they actually shared, the one with sentimental value? But the bed was not just a place for sleeping. It was a central piece of the household's social life. A noblewoman might receive guests while propped up in her bed, a practice that seems bizarre to us, but was perfectly normal at the time. The bed was a place of power and authority. It was also the site of life's great passages. People were born in bed, they spent their illnesses in bed, and they died in bed. The deathbed scene was a particularly important ritual. The dying person would be surrounded by their family and a priest. They would make their final confession, receive the last rites, and say their goodbyes. The bed was the stage for the final, most important act of a person's life, confined to the clergy and the highest echelons of the nobility. For these individuals, the quiet of the Dorval was the perfect time to engage with their treasured texts. Imagine a scholar monk in the deep silence of his monastery scriptorium, the only sound the scratching of his quill on parchment as he copies a classical text by the flickering light of a single tallow candle. The rest of the world is asleep, but he is in communion with the great minds of the past: Aristotle, Augustine, Virgil. The silence would have been absolute, allowing for a level of concentration that is almost impossible to achieve in our constantly connected world. There were no notifications, no emails, no traffic noise. It was a time for deep thought, for contemplation, for the slow, deliberate work of the mind. This wasn't just for monks. A wealthy merchant might use the time to go over his accounts, his mind clear and sharp after his first sleep. A noblewoman might read a book of hours, a personal prayer book, her devotions undisturbed by the hustle and bustle of her household. The Dorval was a time for the kind of focused, solitary mental activity that the communal, demanding nature of medieval daytime life rarely allowed. It was a private mental space carved out of the public, shared space of the night. But what about the vast majority of the population, the illiterate peasantry? For them, the Dorval was less about intellectual pursuits and more about community, chores, and simple human connection. The one-room peasant hut, so crowded and chaotic during the day, would take on a different character in the quiet of the midnight watch. The fire, banked for the night, would provide a dim, warm glow. This was a time for hushed conversations, for the sharing of secrets and stories. A husband and wife, who had little time for private conversation during the day, could speak of their hopes and fears for their children, their worries about the harvest, or their disputes with their neighbors. It was a time for intimacy, not just in the physical sense, but in the emotional sense as well. In a world with no concept of privacy, these stolen moments of quiet connection were incredibly precious. It was also a time for storytelling. In a largely oral culture, stories were the primary means of entertainment, education, and cultural transmission. An elder might recount the tales of local saints, the legends of ancient heroes, or the spooky folklore of the surrounding woods. These stories, told in the deep dark with only the firelight to keep the shadows at bay, would have had a powerful, mesmerizing effect. They reinforced communal values, explained the world, and provided a shared cultural landscape. The Dorval was the natural theater for this kind of intimate, oral performance, and of course there were chores. The medieval household was a site of constant labor, and the work didn't entirely stop when the sun went down. A woman might use the Dorval to do some mending, to spin wool, or to check on her sourdough starter. A man might step outside to check on the livestock, ensuring they were safe from predators, or to bring in more firewood. These were small, quiet tasks that could be done by the faint light of the fire. It was a way of getting a head start on the next day's labor, of making the most of every available moment. This wasn't seen as a burden, but as a natural part of the rhythm of life. The night wasn't wasted time. It was simply a different kind of time, with its own set of tasks and opportunities. However, we shouldn't romanticize the medieval night. For every person finding spiritual solace or quiet connection during the Dorval, there was another person for whom the night was a time of fear and danger. The darkness that provided a cloak for quiet contemplation also provided a cloak for crime. The medieval town, with its narrow, winding, unlit streets, was a dangerous place after dark. While most people were huddled in their homes, the night belonged to the outcasts and the criminals, the thieves, the prostitutes, the brawlers, the desperate. The city watch, a precursor to the modern police force, would patrol the streets, their lanterns casting small, lonely pools of light in the overwhelming darkness. Their cry of "all's well" was a reassurance, but also a reminder of the potential for danger. A sudden noise in the street, the barking of a dog, the sound of a scuffle, these could all be signs of trouble. The walls of your house provided some protection, but they were not impregnable. A determined thief could break in, and in a world where people kept their life savings in a wooden chest at the foot of their bed, a home invasion could be devastating. This brings us to the psychology of medieval sleep, which was profoundly shaped by fear. Our modern fear of the dark is largely a childish, irrational thing. For medieval people, it was entirely rational. The dark held real dangers. The forests that pressed in on their villages and towns were home to wolves and bears, which could and did attack livestock and even people. But the fear went deeper than that. The darkness was also the realm of the supernatural. The medieval worldview was one in which the spiritual world was constantly interacting with the material world. The air was thick with invisible forces, both good and evil. The night was when the veil between these worlds was at its thinnest. Demons, it was believed, were most active at night. They could tempt you in your dreams, afflict you with sickness, or lead you astray if you were foolish enough to be out and about. The figure of the incubus and the succubus, demons who would visit people in their sleep to engage in sexual acts, was a very real fear. An episode of sleep paralysis, which we now understand as a neurological phenomenon, would have been interpreted as a demonic attack, the feeling of a heavy weight on your chest, the physical presence of a demon. People would use talismans, prayers, and charms to protect themselves. A cross might be hung over the bed, a sprig of a particular herb placed under the pillow, a specific prayer recited before going to sleep. These were not superstitions. They were practical measures of spiritual self-defense. And then there were the ghosts. The medieval world was full of ghosts. The souls of the dead, especially those who had died unshriven or had been improperly buried, were believed to wander the earth, unable to find rest. A graveyard was a place to be avoided at night. A crossroads, a place of execution, a battlefield. These were all places where you might encounter a restless spirit. These ghosts were not the ethereal, transparent figures of modern fiction. They were often described as being solid, tangible, and terrifyingly real. They might seek revenge, demand justice, or simply haunt the living out of malice. The fear of ghosts was a powerful force that kept people indoors and reinforced the importance of proper Christian burial. Now, imagine you are a peasant, a serf tied to that lord's land. Your world is the one-room hut you share with your entire family and, in the winter, your most valuable livestock. The concept of privacy is utterly alien. The floor is packed earth, cold and damp. Your bed is a pile of straw in a corner, crawling with fleas and lice. You huddle together with your spouse, your children, and maybe a piglet or two for warmth. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, smoke from the fire, and animal dung. Your first sleep is the sleep of the exhausted, a deep plunge into oblivion after a day of backbreaking labor in the fields. When you wake for the Dorval, the hut is pitch black, the fire reduced to a few glowing embers. Your concerns are more immediate than the Lord's. Is the baby still breathing? Is the roof leaking? Do we have enough firewood to last till morning? You might use this time for a hushed conversation with your spouse, a moment of shared worry or affection in the quiet dark. Or you might simply lie still, listening to the sounds of the night, the wind howling outside, the rustle of the animals, praying for the safety of your family and the coming of the dawn, which signals another day of toil. Your second sleep is a brief respite before the relentless cycle begins again. And what of the clergy, the third pillar of medieval society? Imagine you are a monk in a Benedictine monastery. Your life is governed by the rule of Saint Benedict, a detailed set of instructions for communal living, prayer, and work. Your time is not your own. It belongs to God. Your sleep is strictly regulated, not for personal comfort, but for spiritual discipline. You sleep in a communal dormitory, the beds separated by simple partitions. You sleep in your habit, ready to rise for prayer at a moment's notice. The bell tolls in the dead of night, calling you to the cold chapel for the nocturnes and matins, the midnight services. There is no doorbell for quiet reflection here. Your midnight waking is structured, purposeful, and communal. You stand with your brothers, your voices chanting the ancient psalms, your breath misting in the frigid air. It is a powerful, shared experience, a collective vigil against the darkness of the world. After the service, you return to your bed for a few more hours of sleep before the bell tolls again for lauds at first light. The monk's sleep is a broken, disciplined sleep, a constant reminder that life on earth is a temporary state, a preparation for the eternal life to come. It is a form of spiritual training, hardening the body and soul against the temptations of comfort and ease. This tripartite view of society, those who fight, nobility, those who work, peasantry, and those who pray, clergy, was the theoretical foundation of the medieval world. And as we see, it extended even into the most private and universal of human experiences, sleep. The way you slept, where you slept, and why you woke up in the middle of the night was a direct reflection of your place in this rigid hierarchy. But across all classes, the night was a shared frontier, a time of vulnerability, spirituality, and a different kind of consciousness. This segmented sleep pattern was a practical and cultural adaptation to a world without artificial light, a world where the night was longer, darker, and far more mysterious than our own. It was a rhythm that beat at the heart of medieval life for 1,000 years, a lost world of sleep that we are only now beginning to rediscover. It challenges our modern assumptions about what a good night's sleep really is, suggesting that the path to rest might not be a straight, uninterrupted highway, but a more winding, varied, and perhaps more interesting road. It reminds us that even our most basic biological functions are shaped by the culture and the technology of the times we live in. The medieval night was not an empty void to be slept through, but a space to be inhabited, a time to be used. It was a second, shadow life, lived between the two sleeps. Let's pick up that thread about the Dorval, that mysterious waking period in the heart of the medieval night. It's a concept so alien to our modern sensibilities that it's worth exploring in much greater detail. We tend to view the night as a dead space, a time for the body to shut down and recharge, and any interruption to that process is a source of anxiety. But for our medieval ancestors, this midnight interlude was a vibrant, living part of their day, or rather, their night. It was a third space, neither the structured labor of the day nor the oblivion of sleep, but a quiet, shadowy realm of its own. For the literate few, the Dorval was a golden opportunity. Books were incredibly rare and precious objects in the Middle Ages. Before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, every book was a work of art, painstakingly copied by hand onto expensive parchment or vellum. A single book could cost as much as a small farm. To own one was a mark of significant wealth and status, and to be able to read it was a rare skill, largely. So, people stayed indoors. The entire family, often including servants, would huddle together in a single room for warmth and safety. The fire in the hearth was the center of this small universe, providing a small bubble of light and heat against the oppressive cold and dark. It's in this context that the first sleep begins. It wasn't a gentle drift into dreamland. It was a retreat, a surrender to the darkness, a huddling down for the first and most dangerous part of the night. You slept with your family, your neighbors, sometimes even your animals nearby, the sounds of their breathing a primitive form of security system. The bed itself was a luxury. For the wealthy, it might be a large, curtained four-poster, a room within a room, offering privacy and insulation from drafts. But for the vast majority, the peasantry, the bed, was often just a straw-stuffed mattress on the floor or a simple wooden bench shared with several other people. There was no privacy, no personal space. You slept as you lived, communally. Then, around midnight, the world would stir. The first sleep, deep and restorative, would come to its natural end. The fire would be low, casting long, dancing shadows on the wattle and daub walls. This was the doorvolt, the watch. And it was a profoundly different experience from our modern midnight awakenings, filled with anxiety about getting back to sleep. For the medieval mind, this was a useful and sacred time. The church, the single most powerful institution of the era, structured time itself. The canonical hours, the series of daily prayers, punctuated the day from matins before dawn to compline after sunset. For monks and the devout clergy, this rhythm extended through the night. The midnight prayers were a cornerstone of monastic life, a time when the world was quiet and the connection to God felt most immediate. This practice bled out into the lay community. For the common person, the midnight watch was a perfect opportunity for prayer and reflection, a time to examine one's conscience, to say the rosary, to feel the presence of God in the silent heart of the night. It was a spiritual reset button, but it wasn't all about piety. This was also a practical time. A farmer might get up to check on a sick calf. A woman might mend a tunic by the faint light of the embers. Scholars and scribes, for whom a quiet, uninterrupted period of concentration was a rare gift, used these hours for their most demanding work. And, of course, it was a time for intimacy. Medical texts from the period often advised couples that the best time for conception was not at the end of a long, tiring day, but after the first sleep, when the body was rested and the mind was calm. It was a more relaxed, less frantic approach to life, one that saw the night not as a single, monolithic block of unconsciousness to be conquered, but as a landscape with its own distinct regions and possibilities. As the watch came to an end, people would feel a natural drowsiness return. They would settle back down into their shared beds, into the warmth of huddled bodies and straw mattresses for the second sleep. This sleep was often lighter, filled with more vivid dreams, and would carry them through to the first light of dawn. The dreams of the second sleep were considered particularly significant. In a world where the divine and the demonic were perceived as active forces in daily life, dreams were not just random neural firings. They were messages, omens, and visitations. A dream could be a warning from a patron saint, a temptation from a demon, or a prophecy. People would discuss their dreams with their family or their priest, seeking to interpret their meaning and understand what the supernatural world was trying to tell them. This entire rhythm of sleep was tied to the seasons. In the long, dark winters of Northern Europe, the night was a vast, 14 or 16-hour expanse. The period of first sleep might be longer, the Dorval a more significant and necessary break in the tedium of the darkness. In the summer, with the sun setting late and rising early, the night was shorter, and the two sleeps might merge closer together. Life was governed by natural light, not the artificial tyranny of the clock. This is a stark contrast to our modern world, where we strive for the same 8 hours of sleep every single night, regardless of the season, thanks to electric lights that turn night into day and blackout curtains that keep the morning sun at bay. We have completely detached our sleep from the natural world it evolved with. Let's delve deeper into the social stratification of sleep. Imagine you are a feudal lord in the High Middle Ages, say, the 12th century. Your life is one of relative comfort, but it is also defined by the constant threat of violence. Your home is a castle, a fortress of cold, damp stone. Its primary purpose is not comfort, but defense. Your bedroom, the solar, is a private chamber, a significant step up from the communal hall where your soldiers and servants sleep. You have a large bed, possibly with a canopy and thick woolen curtains. These curtains are not for decoration. They are essential for trapping warmth and creating a small pocket of privacy in a drafty, public world. Your mattress is stuffed with feathers or soft wool, not scratchy straw. You sleep on linen sheets, a sign of immense wealth. But even here, in the heart of your fortress, you are not truly alone. A trusted servant or a squire might sleep on a pallet at the foot of your bed, a human alarm system and bodyguard. Your sleep is punctuated by the changing of the guard on the castle walls, the distant sound of a horn, the barking of dogs. Security is a constant, nagging concern. The Dorval, for you, might be a time to discuss strategy with your captain of the guard, to pore over maps, or to simply lie awake, listening for any sound that might signal an attack. Your sleep is the sleep of a man in charge, a sleep heavy with responsibility.